My name is Ann Limburg, and I am the branch manager of the Scottsville Library. On behalf of the Jefferson Madison Regional Library, welcome to the panel discussion of Maid by Stephanie Land. Thank you so much to our panelists and to all of you for joining us this evening. Tonight's program and all JMRL programming has been made possible by the incredible and generous support of the Friends of the Library. We are also very lucky to have Evan from the Northside Library here with us tonight to help with any technical issues. This evening's program will be recorded for inclusion on JMRL's YouTube channel, and barring any technical difficulties, we hope to have it posted in the next few days. The closed caption transcript has been enabled for this evening's program, and you can activate this feature by selecting Live Transcript at the bottom of your screen and enabling subtitles. A quick reminder that the transcript is not flawless and that you cannot save or download the transcript. The panelists are happy to answer your questions and address your comments at the end of the program. You may enter them into the chat, which is located at the bottom of your screen. And with that said, it is my pleasure to introduce this evening's panelists. Dr. Jeanine Braithwaite is a retired professor of public policy at the Frank Batten School of Leadership and Public Policy at the University of Virginia, where she taught a seminar on U.S. poverty. She arrived at UVA after a career at the World Bank fighting global poverty, and she continues to be committed to issues of poverty at both the global and national level. Madison Furgurson, MSW, is a legal advocate for Shelter for Help in Emergency, a domestic violence shelter in Charlottesville, where she has worked since 2016. In her current position as the Lethality Assessment Program Coordinator, she supports clients through the criminal process by attending court proceedings, as well as law enforcement and prosecutor interviews. Dr. Stacy Pethia is the Housing Policy Manager for Albemarle County. In this role, she develops policies and programs designed to expand affordable housing options in the county and supports the efforts of developers and nonprofit housing providers' efforts to meet the housing needs of county residents. Dean Ridge Schuyler graduated from the University of Virginia School of Law and is Dean of the Piedmont Virginia Community College's Self-Sufficiency programs, which work to provide training and support for people in the community who've been left behind in our economy. In 2011, Dean Schuyler published the Orange Dot Report, which highlighted the economic struggles of many families in the Charlottesville area. Welcome to all of you. Thank you for being here. Let's get started. In the memoir Maid by Stephanie Land, which is now a popular series on Netflix, the main character faces domestic violence and flees her home with her young daughter. She then faces constant struggles and challenges as she tries to provide for herself and her daughter, and poverty and homelessness are constant issues. This true story is about one family, but it reflects something that is happening all over the country. Dr. Braithwaite, let's start with you. You have said that the United States has one of the highest rates of poverty and child poverty among the high-income countries. Can you give us a brief overview of poverty in America?
You bet, Ann. It'll be my pleasure. I'm going to be an old professor and share my screen and have some slides come up. Let's hope that works. Okay, here we go. All right, at this point, you should be able to see the slide. Can you give me a verbal confirmation, Ann, that you can see it?
Yeah, looks good.
Fantastic. Okay, great. All right, so I'm going to speak for 5 very brief minutes about poverty in the United States. And so I just wanted to start with the poverty line. The official poverty measure was developed in the mid-1960s by Molly Orshansky, a staff economist at the Social Security Administration. She was quite a pathbreaker. I was able to meet her in person before she passed away, which is wonderful. So she developed poverty thresholds derived from the cost of a minimum food diet multiplied by 3 to account for other family expenses. Now, there is a problem with not changing this multiplier since the 1960s, and we'll be talking about this in the context of Maid, but other expenses, non-food expenses, have shot up since the 60s, particularly housing. So the poverty line, the poverty threshold ought to be higher. It ought to be something like a factor of 5, but no administration has been willing to preside over that change because it would increase the number of measured poor, I think. If you want more information about poverty and the history of the poverty measure, here's a link. And then there's also a link at the bottom of the slide to this report. The current population report, it comes out once a year, and it's when the United States Census Bureau measures poverty in the United States. So it comes out in October. So this is the most recent one in October. And what we have here are some pictures of the number of people in poverty and the poverty rate. And what you can see is that the poverty rate tends to go up during times of recession. And then it got a little bit better. And then what happened in 2020? COVID, and you see that spike in poverty rates there. Let's talk a little bit about the composition of poverty. This is from the report as well. And if you look on the far right column, you'll see that in 2020, 11.4% of the US population was below poverty. And this was not predominantly white, non-Hispanic people. Their poverty rate was only 8.2, but people of color at 19.5. And then if you look down into the middle of the table, you will see that poverty is higher for men than women, and poverty is much higher for children than it is for the elderly. Although poverty is changing in the United States, and the poverty is becoming more suburban, it's becoming more white, and more elderly people. And if you liked Maid, you might want to read the book Nomadland, which is also a movie, which talks about poverty in the transient elderly people, which is something that we really hadn't seen until the Great Recession. Okay, that's my overview. Thanks a lot. And now I think I've stayed to time, so I'll turn it back to you.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Now I'm going to turn to you, Dean Schuyler. You've noted that there are too many families in our community who do not earn enough to meet their basic needs. When you worry every month about paying the landlord, every week about buying groceries, every day about whether your car will start, it is difficult to be the parent you want to be, the worker you know you could be, or the person you were meant to be. Can you talk a little about that quote and about the economic situation locally?
Yes, I sure can. And one of the challenges is just defining your terms. And in terms of the struggles of the people in our community, I look at what does it cost to survive in our community, and that is what does it cost to buy food, to have shelter, pay your utility bills, and what we see is that a single mom with 2 kids living in a 2-bedroom apartment would need to earn almost $45,000 a year in order to make ends meet. And I've looked at data in our community that shows that almost 1 out of every 5 families in our region doesn't even earn $35,000 a year. And that obviously is far too many. It's over 10,000 families that don't earn enough to meet their basic needs without some external form of assistance. And as the book Maid describes, getting that assistance can be demeaning and difficult. And so what we're trying to do is try to help people earn enough to provide for their families, which is at the end of the day what we all want. We want to be able to provide for our families, and we want to have agency over our lives. We want to have dominion and control over what happens to us and our families. When you are constantly going from agency to try to collect aid, you don't have agency. You're visiting agencies, but you don't have agency yourself. And so, we are really struggling as a community when we have 1 out of 5 families that doesn't earn enough to be self-sufficient. And then to bear down on that just a little bit more, while that's sad on its face, when you look at the racial composition of the struggles, it is not shared equally. So in our region, while 17% of all families make less than $35,000 a year, it's 14% of white families and over 30% of Black families. And so the income distribution is not even. And I would suggest that 17% would be your equity line, and you would expect that if all things were equal or equitable, there'd be 70% of white families and 17% of Black families that fell below that line. But as we know, it is very disproportionate. And so we need to be incredibly intentional about how to identify that problem and solve it.
Thank you. Thank you. And now turning to you, Madison, the author of Maid also faces domestic violence. And you observed Maid is an incredible testimony to the most common and least recognized type of domestic violence, emotional abuse. It can be just as traumatic, if not more so, as physical abuse, but it is not recognized by our legal justice system. It's so important that we talk about and acknowledge these experiences so that people can feel more comfortable asking for help when they need it. Can you talk about the impact of domestic violence in our community?
Yeah, absolutely. In terms of what we've been talking about so far, poverty and domestic violence go hand in hand. They really become a vicious cycle because poverty makes it very hard to escape domestic violence, and domestic violence really keeps people from moving out of poverty. Poverty and homelessness are two of the most common reasons people stay in abusive relationships, or why they return to abusive relationships after they've tried to leave. It can look like their partner might forbid them from working or take control of whatever wages or money that they earn. They may have little to no work experience if they've been relying on their partner's income. So when they attempt to leave and create a new life for themselves, it's difficult to find work without lots of experience. Even if they do work, like Dean Schuyler mentioned, finding affordable housing on a single income is almost impossible. You need a security deposit, you need first month's rent, possibly a deposit for utilities. It's also common for people to have bad credit or histories of eviction due to their partner failing to pay rent or opening credit cards or taking loans out in their name. So that kind of financial abuse is, I would say financial and emotional abuse are probably the two most common things that we see. And then third would be, actual physical violence, which is what most people think of if they've never experienced it, or prior to this show, what we saw in TV and movies was, black eyes, very visible physical domestic violence. So I was really glad that it addressed that emotional abuse is abuse, and the damage that it can have. So in addition to all of these barriers, you also have the mental effects of that emotional abuse that you've been through, that you're trying to deal with. Having children in common is another important reason why people feel they can't leave a relationship, sort of similar to the book and the movie. Their partner may threaten to sue them for custody and say things like, "You'll never see the kids again." There's pressure from family, friends, religious communities, cultural communities to provide a stable two-parent home, especially because abusers tend to act differently in public. And so people will often say to victims, "I don't know what you're talking about. They've always been nice to me," because they've never experienced the other side of that person the way that the victim does. So. And then we see in the book and the show, and like Dean Schuyler mentioned, the stigma and shame associated with using, government benefit programs. That there's this sense of poverty as a problem of laziness, or people just not wanting to work or not trying hard enough. And our clients really internalize that and start to believe that it's true about themselves. But without those programs or some kind of family support, it's virtually impossible to create a new independent life, to not go back to what is familiar, even if it's harmful.
Thank you. Thank you.
And before you pass this off to Dr. Pethia,
sure.
can I just bootstrap up something Madison said?
Yeah.
It's not the hard work, it's the low wages. 2/3 of the families that are struggling in our community work for a living. They work full time for a living. It's just that their labor is not valued. And one of the incredible misconceptions about poverty in America is that poor people don't work. And the fact of the matter is, and as Maid suggested, they probably work harder than I do, sitting in my dean's chair when they're doing manual labor and they're not valued. So I think part of the stigma of being poor in America is there's the belief that you're not working hard, and it's actually the exact opposite that is true.
Thank you for sharing that. Thank you. And also I should say, anytime you feel free to definitely respond to each other's comments. I welcome that. Thank you. Thank you. Well, so now I would like to shift a little, and we're going to talk start to talk a little bit about some of the ways maybe some of these issues can be alleviated. So Dr. Pethia, can you talk a little about the work you do in local and affordable housing?
Yeah, sure. So my primary responsibility is to really make sure that there are affordable housing options within Albemarle County. And that's a bit tough to do. It's expensive to build housing. It costs the same amount to build an affordable unit as it does to build a market rate unit. So as the cost of construction through the pandemic and into today continues to rise, it becomes more and more difficult to build those affordable units. So there are ways that we can help. Some of that is looking at providing incentives, whether those are cash incentives to help bring down the cost of construction, providing bonus densities for developers so they can build more units and offset the cost of those lower rents and sale prices. We can look at rental assistance, which is one thing that was brought up in Maid. She received tenant-based rental assistance. That was her TBRA. It took me a while to figure out what she was talking about. And that really provides a rental assistance each month. And so the tenant will pay 30% of their income. So if they only earn $100 a month, they will only pay $30 of their own income towards the rent. And that rental assistance makes up the difference between what they can pay and a maximum rent that that voucher or other assistance will cover. There are issues with that because the government sets those maximum rents at a price that's really low, much lower than what you can get market rate. And so landlords are hesitant and sometimes just refuse to take those rental assistance vouchers. One, they can get a heck of a lot more money from someone like me or any of us here just walking in, and we don't have credit issues. We have a job, the landlord feels comfortable, we can continue to pay our rent. There are a lot of rules attached to these programs because these are taxpayer dollars. So the government wants to make sure that they're being used in the most efficient way possible. There are misconceptions about the types of people that receive rental assistance. So that goes back to the stigma that everyone has been talking about. The idea is that someone who has a rental assistance voucher is not working, they're lazy, it's going to be a single mother and she's going to have 18 children and they're going to run wild and rampant and disturb all the neighbors. She's going to have loud parties all night long. It's going to be drugs and alcohol. But as Ridge pointed out, most of these people work full-time jobs, sometimes 2 or 3, just to make the rent. So you have to get through all of those misconceptions and stigmas that go along with that. And then there's other ways. I mean, we can set rents at a certain level with any projects that the county provides funding to. So if I give a developer money to help pay to construct their buildings, I can then set a rent that maximum rent level or a sale price that they need to sell that to and target those units towards specific people. Those are really the main ways that housing is taken care of. They did forget, we do have public housing. We have one public housing authority in our area, and that is Charlottesville Redevelopment and Housing Authority. And public housing is federally assisted. Public housing is owned and managed by a housing authority. Again, tenants pay what they can, so generally about 30% of their rent, and then they get, the housing authority gets money from the government to help maintain those buildings. Unfortunately, Congress over the years has taken away, cut the budget to public housing authorities, which is why you end up in situations like the CRHA is in today, where their properties are failing. The units are really old. They have not been able to maintain them over the years because they haven't had the money. So those are some of the ways we can help. Also in the, I have not read the book, but I did watch the Netflix series. She mentioned something about waiting lists. Just about every rental assistance program does have a waiting list attached to it, and they can often run for years long. So I think in both the city and the county, it is at least a 2 to 4 year wait once you get onto the waiting list to even learn whether or not you qualify to receive a rental assistance voucher. So those are some of the ways. Some of them are good. There are issues attached to them that make them really difficult to get to your rental assistance. And housing is so important for everything that we do. If you are in a situation where your child is taken away and placed into foster care, you must have a home in order to get that kid back. So having to sit on a waiting list for a rental voucher for 2 to 4 years is not going to help with that family reunification in any way, shape, or form. You need an address to get a job. There's a whole lot of other stuff that you need a house for. So figuring out ways to make housing accessible and affordable is one of the really important things that we have to do today.
Thank you. Wow. Well, now, Madison, can you tell us a little about what your organization, Shelter for Help in Emergency, provides for community members in need?
Yeah, absolutely. So the first thing that we have is a 24-hour hotline. So people can call and talk through their situation, learn about our services at any time of day. We have, if their abuser works at night and 2 a.m. is the only time they have in private to talk about what's going on, we've got someone there that can answer the phone, just be a listening ear, or tell them about the other services that we have. We have an emergency shelter that can house up to 10 individuals and their children. And we typically house people for up to 6 weeks. And then we also have 2 transitional homes where people can stay for up to 2 years, depending on what their situation is and how much time they need to find more permanent housing. Our case managers will work with clients, whether they're physically in our shelter or if they're, they have their another place to stay. We call them outreach clients, but they will help with applying for jobs, securing benefits, working with their kids' schools, referring them to other community resources as needed. And then we have legal advocates like myself that will explain their legal options. None of us are lawyers, but we can at least talk them through the process of what it's like to press criminal charges, to get a protective order, file for custody or child support. And we'll also accompany them to any of their court appearances or interviews with law enforcement or prosecutors, just so they don't have to go through it alone. I think it helps a lot for people to know what to expect, because I think for any of us, just going to a courthouse is intimidating, and the judge up in on their pedestal looking down at you. So giving them an idea of what each step will look like, and what people will be asking for, from them, I think is really helpful. And so our office and our shelter are in Charlottesville, but we provide services to Nelson, Fluvanna, Louisa, and Greene counties as well.
Madison, can I ask you a quick question? And also for Albemarle County, I assume too then,
And
right?
Albemarle.
Okay. And then I had another quick question. Are the services that you just described, are those free? Do people have to pay for them? Okay, they're
yes,
free.
Those are all free. I also forgot to mention, we do have one counselor on staff. So we typically can get people in with her very quickly. If for some reason her schedule is full, or if someone wants more long-term therapy or just wants another option, we usually refer people to the Women's Initiative here in same thing, their office is in Charlottesville, but they serve the, I forget what this district is, District 10
Okay.
area. So the same counties that we serve. So counseling is another important part of whether they get it directly from us or somewhere else. But yes, all of our services are free and confidential, meaning that we cannot share anything that they tell us without their permission, unless there's a child that's in danger of abuse or that person has expressed an intent to hurt themselves. So they don't have to report to the police. There's no requirement that they leave the abusive relationship in order to get services from us. So we're not here to tell anyone what's best for them or what action they should be taking, just to, be a listening ear and sit with them without judgment and help them know what options are available to them.
Thank you. And Dr. Braithwaite, what has your research indicated in terms of ways to alleviate poverty? I mean, we've been talking about local resources, but what about, before I get to you, Dr. Braithwaite, I'm going to go back to Dean Schuyler. Can you just let me know about the PVCC program, what you do in that program?
Yeah, and before I do, I'm just going to say, Madison, I can testify to the fear of going into court. As it was mentioned, I was a lawyer for about 10 minutes, and the very first words a judge ever uttered to me were "Shut up, counselor." And I'm like, this isn't going well. Never happened to Perry Mason. But to Dr. Pethia's point about housing, and just to put a fine point on it, HUD says that the maximum rent, or the market rent for an apartment in Albemarle for a 2-bedroom apartment, at least when they took their snapshot earlier last year, was $1,266 a month. That's $15,000 a year for your rent. And back when the minimum wage was $7.25 an hour, that single mom working full time would make $14,400 a year. So even working full time, she couldn't even make the rent. Now, Virginia has increased its minimum wage to $9.50. So now that single mom working full time at minimum wage will bring home $19,000. So that's $4,000 beyond rent that she could use to pay for food, childcare, transportation, utilities. The challenge that we have is that poor people do not make enough money. And if you were to ask me, what is the solution to poverty? And I think Dr. Braithwaite will back me up on this. The way to solve poverty is to give money to poor people. Now, in our economy, that means getting a job that pays a decent wage. And if you get a job that pays a decent wage, it is an answer, not the answer, but an answer to our affordable housing crisis, because affordable housing is housing you can afford by definition. And if you make more money, you can afford more housing. And so the focus of Network to Work is to try to figure out, how do we identify those low-income people who are not valued in our economy and connect them to job and career opportunities that pay them a decent wage. And that's what we do. We've served over 1,100 job seekers at this point. In our network of employers at Network to Work, we have $13 million worth of available jobs waiting for the job seekers to grab those jobs and pull down that income. So we have over 200 jobs in our community, and we're talking, UVA and Centera Martha Jefferson and LA Lacey Plumbing and Northrop Grumman defense contractors. Employers, there are employers, and we see this in the headlines every day, there are employers out there who are desperate to hand money to people. They just need to find the money to hand the people, they need to find the people to hand the money to. Network to Work uses neighborhood-based connectors, the people in neighborhoods who just know everybody. We feed those neighborhood-based connectors that job information. Who's hiring into jobs that pay a decent wage, $30,000 or more, with an ability to climb the ladder into family-sustaining wage? We take that job information and we hand it to those socially well-connected people in their neighborhoods, the go-to people who just seem to know what's going on in a community. We feed them job information and they stop and think, who do I know that would be good at that? Who do I know that's working part-time at a retail establishment who might have taken care of their great aunt when she was sick and would be great in a career in nursing, but had never even thought about the possibility? Mm-hmm. That job in nursing, which as a licensed practical nurse pays $40,000 a year, that job in nursing may be 3 blocks from where they live, but it may as well be on Mars based on their historical experience and that of their parents. Mm-hmm. What we're doing is we're taking people that they trust and saying, hey, if the people they trust know about those jobs, we can connect people to those jobs. That's so cool. And then lastly, it's fine to get that job information and those employers that are desperate to hire and convey that information to job seekers using people that they know and trust. The last piece of network to work is to wrap services around that person so they get everything they need. If they're in a domestic violence situation, we need to make sure they get to the she shelter. We need to make sure that if they're trying to get a job in nursing, but haven't been to a doctor in 10 years and have painful flat feet, that they go to the Charlottesville Free Clinic and get their feet looked at so they can stand on their feet for 4 hours at a time, which is required for that job. We make sure that they have a car that works, because much as I like public transportation and much as I'm concerned about climate change, which I am, sadly, in our community, people need to be independently mobile to get these entry-level jobs, because they're shift work at the hospital, they're get yourself to the job site. If you're an apprentice plumber, you almost have to be independently mobile. And if you've got kids, almost definitely, because by the time you try to get the kids to the daycare and to your job using the transportation options you have, you're now 3 hours into your commute. So network to work takes that job information, we convey it to the people left behind in our economy by people that they trust, and then we wrap services around them so that when they apply for the job, they have everything they need in order to be a quality employee. Yes, they've been trained by PVCC to be a certified nurse assistant making $30,000 a year at UVA or Centera Martha Jefferson, but yes, they also have a car that works. Yes, they also have physical health care. They have mental health care. We're partners with the Women's Initiative as well. They have everything they need because it's the whole person who shows up to work, not just the trained person, the whole person. And so we support the whole person so they can get and keep that job and earn the income that they deserve and get compensated for the labor that they put in to the community that we have. And so that's essentially what network to work is.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you. And I apologize, Jeanine, for cutting you off earlier. So now that we've seen some of the local ways that these issues are being addressed, can you kind of indicate how maybe we could address some of these issues in a country as a whole?
Sure. Well, first of all, I want to say that Dean Schuyler and I have connected several years ago, and we're in complete agreement. The poor people need more money. Now, there are a couple different ways to skin the cat. One way is the excellent way that Network to Work does, which provide the wraparound services that poor people need to get out of poverty in a better paying job, and the education. Another thing that we can think about is kind of getting our social policy more in line with high-income countries, and that would be to be giving more generous social benefits. I spent about 20 years at the World Bank and another 10 plus consulting for the bank while I was at Batten, working on what the bank calls cash transfers for poor people. And I spent quite a lot of effort doing that around the world. And I could tell you that most of the programs are rather similar in that they work towards getting cash to poor people, particularly things like a child benefit, which is something that we do not have in the United States, and we ought to. If you go back and look at my slides, and anybody can Google me and find me at Batten, if you back and look at those slides, you'll see that the poverty rate is much higher for children than it is for elderly people, although elderly people are having trouble with poor. And that's because most children live in working poor families and who are facing the kind of issues that our other panelists have laid out in terms of finding affordable housing, finding a decent job. Transportation is a huge barrier to getting a good job. So if we just gave more money to children, we would be like our peers in the European Union, and we would have much less trouble with child poverty and with poverty in general. The vindictive attitude that we have towards the poor as being somehow inferior for getting government transfers is ridiculous. I mean, I'm here because of a government transfer program. My grandfather worked in the Works Project Administration during the Great Depression, and it's a good thing he did, because otherwise he wouldn't have put food on the table and there wouldn't have been my mother. So I think that it's about time that we realize that we need to stop stigmatizing poverty and start solving it. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, let me see. I'm going to go, let me see if I can find try to see if any of our attendees have asked any questions here.
And while you're looking at that, I just, I sometimes call it the corrosive myth of the American dream, which is the theory that if you work hard and play by the rules, that you will get ahead. And the fact of the matter is, you can work really, really hard and not get ahead. And if you have been living under stress your whole life, your opportunities, your perspective, what is possible for you, are greatly diminished. And so we as a society kneecap people for being poor and then ask them to run as fast as everybody else. And we, some would cynically say, conveniently say, we don't need to help poor people with cash transfer payments because it's their fault they're poor, because the only reason they're poor is because they've made bad choices. And if they made better choices, and so it's a very convenient excuse not to help poor people by saying, well, if you're poor, it's your own fault. Well, if you're poor, you buy a poor car. If you buy a poor car, it needs expensive repairs. If you are poor, you can't afford the repairs, then you don't show up at work 2 times, and then you get fired. And what I say to employers often is, it is not the employee who is unreliable, it is their car that is unreliable. It is their childcare that is unreliable. They as human beings are incredibly reliable. We got to solve these other problems if we want them to make it in America. And that's what cash transfer payments allow us to do.
Thank you.
I just want to jump on that. Oh, do you have questions? Did people?
No, go ahead, Madison, go.
I just want to jump on, and it just reminded me a lot of the stigma associated with people that experience domestic violence. There's a lot of shame. People don't want to tell their friends or their family members that they're going through it, because pretty much the knee-jerk reaction from most people is, why don't you just leave? Or if the statistic we usually cite it takes people up to 7 times to permanently leave an abusive situation. And so they're, why haven't you left already? Why did you go back? So there's this failure of people to look at, similar to poverty, to think about, well, what are the reasons behind this person staying in this relationship? Can they even afford to live somewhere else if they left that relationship? I had a client that, we were talking about options for her to leave, and she just told me, there's no one else to watch my kids while I go to work. So there are all these things going on in the background where, as a third party or outside observer, we can say, well, this is harmful to you. You should leave. You shouldn't be with that person anymore. But yeah, I think it's important for people to think about what, whether it be poverty or domestic violence or substance use or whatever issue that this person is facing. And a lot of times it's all of those combined, is we tend to, at least in America, really view these things as personal failings or failings of character or failings of people to just make the right decision. But there's so much going on that lead to those things. And then, of course, we're not asking, well, why do you abuse your wife? Or we're not asking why abusers do what they do. We're telling, the majority of our victims are women. We're telling women, why don't you just leave? Why don't you save your kids from this situation? Why don't you do this, and this? Right. So
Yeah, so what I hear you saying, Madison, is we're kind of putting the burden of blame in this case on the woman rather than on the abuser. And what I
Yep.
hear all of you saying is a sort of misconception or misunderstanding of, first of all, what poverty is, and who poor people are, what they do, what they don't do. And I think what you were saying, Jeanine, is that it could be any of us, given different circumstances. So how would you, if one of the ways to kind of change or shift policy is to also change that narrative, how does one go about doing that? If anyone wants to jump in there.
I will say it really helps when you have a World Bank loan that you can hold over the government and get them to agree to some of the things. If you have to be in partnership, you have to convince them. But it is helpful when you have a big incentive like that. So I'm a little bit, maybe other panelists can chime in here, but I'm a little bit worried about the lack of social consensus that we have in the United States towards dealing with these issues. And it's kind of a depressing time to be in the business of trying to recommend policy for eliminating poverty, when I can see everybody who's worked with poor people. And by the way, these issues are quite similar to developing countries. I don't have any working experience in Europe because they don't, in the European Union, because they don't borrow from the World Bank. But it's just a very tough thing to get people to understand. Whereas if you have any experience, if you've ever talked to poor people, people who are poor, they want to work. They just want to be paid decently. And they want to, send their kids to school, but, they need childcare. They need, childcare programs before and after school. They need a way to get their kids to school. They need something when the kids are young. So there's all these things that are just so obvious to me. And I really, quite honestly, don't understand why it is such a difficult sell in this country, other than what I believe it was Dean Schuyler who said, this pernicious American dream that we can all just pull ourselves up from our bootstraps, and that we don't have white privilege and we don't have these other things that have enabled us to get ahead, that low income people lack. So I really wish that could change.
And I would, I think, Madison's point about, we say to women, why don't you just leave? But we don't say to the men, why don't you just stop? Right. But, to the point about staying with somebody in order to have somebody watch your children while you go to work. And to Dr. Braithwaite's point, childcare in our community annually costs $13,000 a year for one kid. That's what, and so you have to work almost your entire paycheck, if you're making minimum wage, just to pay the childcare so that you can go to work. So if somebody is willing to watch your kids for quote unquote free, and the free isn't free, it's you suffer domestic abuse as a result, but you don't have to pay for it. If we keep putting those penalties on working parents, they cannot get ahead. And if you imagine you're working every day at your job just trying to make ends meet, you're not stopping to think, oh, I wonder what training programs they have over at the community college that would give me more skills that make me more valuable in the workplace. You're just trying to get from one day to the next. And so without familial support, without public support, asking people to do this on their own, and to put a fine point on it, if you're an hourly worker, which a lot of these folks are, they're not salaried like me. If I miss a couple of days of work, I get paid no matter what. If you're an hourly worker, you miss a couple of days of work, you never get that money back. You're now permanently behind. And so now you don't have enough to pay the rent on time. The 5-day grace period comes and goes. You then get paid, but you're behind and your rent just went up $90, which is the late penalty. And now you're perpetually behind because you never get caught up. And so your rent just went up $90 a month because you missed a couple of days of work because you sprained an ankle. Similarly, if you had to change jobs and you were out of work for a couple of weeks, this is a true story. A friend a job seeker in our network had to get a title loan on her minivan in order to get cash to pay the rent so that she and her children would not get evicted. She put up her van as security for that title loan. The interest rate on that title loan was 237%. She ended up paying more in interest than the vehicle was worth when her 12-month interest loan was done. That is the reality of life for poor people. They can't turn to their friends and say, hey, can you spot me a couple of $100 for rent, because their friends don't have any money. They're not going to grandma because grandma doesn't have any money. So they go to a title loan company to get that money so they can keep a roof over their head and keep their kids going to school. And as a result, the only thing they own, they now have to buy back from the title loan company at 237% interest. That is the reality of living. And that's not in Missoula, Montana. That's not in the Pacific Northwest. That's right here in Charlottesville, in Albemarle. These are the things that people face in reality every day, and not because they're not working hard. They're working really hard and are far more resilient than I will ever be.
I think it's fair to say that each and every one of us is one accident, one illness, one pandemic that shuts down the world away from being homeless, honestly. So there has to be a way that we can get individuals to start thinking differently about poverty and benefits. I know people in previous jobs who were struggling. Their house burnt to the ground. There's one couple in particular, their house burnt to the ground. They went to live with their daughter, and their son-in-law had found a job for them, which turned out to not be true. Daughter asked them to leave their home because they were getting in the way and they weren't working. And so I recommended that they go and at least apply for SNAP benefits, right? So they could eat. And she said, my daughter told me I can't do that because we're not those kind of people. So people are hesitant to help themselves when they are in dire situations because of the stigma attached to benefits. And I think we have to start there. I mean, it's one thing to get politicians to begin to talk about and consider providing extra benefits and enhancing our social benefit system, which is incredibly important. But if we don't get people, individuals, to think differently about that, right? I mean, we're not saying that there's nothing wrong with asking for help, right? You asked your daughter and she's obviously not going to help you. So you got to do something. And until we figure out how to get people to think differently about asking for assistance, we're going to have a tough time getting anything done, I think.
And I feel like a big part of we talked about stigma, we talked about the mindset of why don't people feel like these types of changes are worth pursuing, or why do we have this bias towards people living in poverty. And I feel like we just have to start with passing it along to our kids, because I know for myself as a privileged white woman, I didn't know that these problems existed and truly believed that anyone could be anything they wanted to be if they just tried hard enough. I didn't realize how naive that was until I was in college. Like we weren't having these discussions with my family or at my school or in my community. We were not having these discussions about racial privilege or what it takes to get out of poverty, or the fact that the poverty line was created in 1960 and no longer relevant. I didn't get that information until I was actively in my social work education. So I feel like watching shows like this as a family, or telling your friends to watch shows like this, or even outside of entertainment, just having these conversations in our churches or with your nieces and nephews or in schools. We do at the She Shelter, we have a prevention coordinator who goes to middle and high schools and talks about healthy relationships so that kids can actually start thinking about what behaviors are healthy and what behaviors are not healthy in a relationship, instead of just assuming that what they see on TV or in movies or even at home, which is where people typically learn abusive behavior or learn to accept abusive behavior. So we have to start from the ground up, teaching kids that that these things are not shameful, and the more that we talk about them, and the more people are willing to ask for help and don't feel like they have to hide it or feel ashamed that they're going through it.
And in terms of policy and mindset, I mean, I think it is important. We are a very generous nation. I mean, as individuals, we want to help. We are inclined to do barn raisings and help our neighbors. But there is something that has happened to poison the body politic that somehow divorces our own sense of generosity from this idea that people who receive public benefits are somehow undeserving of that generosity. And it is the idea of not wanting to help the undeserving. We have created a stereotype of poor people that has de facto classified them as undeserving, and therefore I can turn away from them. Even though I am generous in my life, I can turn away from them because they do not deserve my assistance. And it is that stereotype that we have to do everything we can to overcome. And that stereotype is not just on the people who are providing or who we're asking to provide additional help. It is also the people who, as Dr. Pethia said, are to receive the help. If you believe that you are unworthy and you have to prostrate yourself in front of the system in order to get any help and go around and prove your poverty at every step of the way, you're not going to feel very deserving. You're not going to feel like you are a future registered nurse at UVA hospital. And, in my own life, my parents divorced when I was very young, back in the 1960s when that was not done. My mom raised 4 boys, never earned more than $22,000 a year in her life. She would be classified as poor, but we never felt poor. And the reason was because my mom happened to have gotten a scholarship to the University of Virginia way back when. She was in the first class of women accepted in the University of Virginia because she was going to be a teacher. In our household, it was always assumed that we were going to college. It was never a question. And so all 4 of us went to college because it was there wasn't any other option. If you did not grow up in a house where going to college was just of course you're going to go to college, then you're already starting with a more limited mindset of what is possible for you. And then when society has beaten down your parents and their parents before them and their parents before them, your view of what is possible for you gets narrower and narrower until you think the only thing that is possible for you is childcare or hair care, because that's the world that you can see. And so we have so stigmatized the need for help because the American dream exists in all of our society, not just for the well-to-do, but also for the poor. They believe that, well, I'm poor, I must have done something, because in America, you don't have to be poor if you work hard and play by the rules. But that just isn't the case. And well, I'm a history major, I'm not a math major. I did put a math formula in my Orange Dot Report 4.0, and it was this. Hard work times high wage equals high income. Hard work times low wage equals low income. It's not the hard work, it's the wage. And either we can raise the floor on that wage, raising the minimum wage would be one example of doing that, or we can go individual by individual, like Network to Work does, and say, you're worth more than you're being paid. Let us help you get to that better job so that you can pull down that better income. It is a very laborious process because in that instance, poverty ends one family at a time, but that's the only way we know how to do it right now, unless the floor is raised through cash transfers or minimum wage or pre-K that's available to everybody. Those kinds of public policies that level that playing field and open up the opportunities for more people.
So I want to jump in here and call attention to the other big problem in this country, and that is the social stratification that has happened from exploding income inequality. So now we have a situation where we're not actually interacting with people across classes the way, like, for example, that happened when I was growing up as a child. You had bowling leagues and you met other people, things like that. We're not doing that now. We're, withdrawing. The higher income people, when I say we, are withdrawing, and the lower income people are left, and they have the problem that Dean Schuyler mentioned, which is, you need car repairs. You don't have anybody in your network that you can borrow $300 or $400 from, which is not a problem if you're, middle to high income. But what's happened is our middle has been hollowing out. And so we have more people who are poor, and we have some people that are super wealthy. And we have a situation where it used to be that the difference between the lowest paid worker and and a boss was, I think it was 22, and now I think it's 237. Because we've just had this explosion in not taxing the uber wealthy. And the problem with income inequality is, I'm seeing in our own country, I've seen it in many developing countries that also have huge or even worse inequality problems, is that it wrecks social stability. It wrecks social cohesion, and it leads to people really having the attitude that we've all identified here, of stigmatizing poor people in America as not being deserving of benefits, and as Dr. Pethia mentioned, and they've internalized that too. So now they think they're not deserving themselves of help. So we really have a major problem here with the explosion of income inequality. Thanks.
I think what I hear you saying is that there would have been a time where people of different incomes would have mingled more, and there would have been, and now because there's less of that, it's even easier to stigmatize a person suffering poverty as, the other, or somebody who is, just somebody completely different than who you are, or which is interesting. Dr. Schuyler, you noted education, and that's kind of a big part of Maid. Like, when the fact that she is able to go to college, you sense this future of hope. But that's not an easy thing. I mean, I feel like, you mentioned universal pre-K, but to even get to the point of going to college, you will have had to probably graduate high school or have a GED. So it seems like it starts very early to even get to that point.
Yep. And so, first of all, just the idea of whether college is within reach for you, as we all know, if your parents didn't go to college, it is very difficult to turn that ship and say, college is something that is possible for you. Another challenge, though, is if you have been left behind in the economy, and I would say that there are people who have been intentionally left behind in our economy. If you've been left behind in our economy, something did not work for you. Some institution, whether it was your high school that you didn't graduate from, some institution in America did not work for you. And yet we ask people to turn back to institutions to help solve their issues. Okay. And then we act surprised that people are disconnected or distrustful of the very institutions that are set up to help them. And the fact of the matter is, if institutions don't step into the void and solve some of these problems, then we'll see the further stratification where more and more people say, the government, that has never done anything for me. Why should I vote? Why should I vote when my circumstances and the circumstances of my family haven't changed in generations? And so then you get people who are civically disengaged. They're not likely to turn back to institutions and say, hey, and so when we talk about fundamental change in our body politic, a huge portion of the people who need the change are disconnected from that very system and not participating because the system has let them down for so long. And so one of the reasons it's so hard to effect change, besides the not mingling and seeing how these institutions have helped, this person that I used to go bowling with, we have failed to deliver. And as you fail to deliver, people become more and more disenchanted with the system. They throw up their hands and say, never mind. And they just keep plugging away at the low income job that they got with their GED without thinking that maybe they should go back and get additional skills that make them more valuable. And so it's an erosion of trust in our institutions. Very difficult to overcome unless institutions deliver.
I also want to point out, Dean Schuyler, that not every institution is as committed as PVCC is. So there are a number of predatory, we'll call them loosely institutions. I don't want to grace them with the word universities or colleges, but there's been an enormous debt that people have run up for these for-pay universities that take the money of the poor and don't deliver job skills and don't deliver the kind of education that people need to be able to get into better paying jobs. So, I'm a little cautious about education because, people don't have the ability to discriminate between an institution that might get them job skills and an institution that'll just rip them off.
Yep. So our challenge, if we can't by fiat provide more money, or if we can't provide a more generous set of benefits, then we have gotten down to the point where we need to make people's skill more valuable. And I am fortunate to work at a community college that is very committed to trying to give people the skills they need that are actually in demand, and not just fill the seats in order to collect the tuition money. But Dr. Braithwaite is right. That is not every institution of higher learning. And there is an enormous amount of predation that is done on poor people, whether it's payday lenders, title loans that I've already mentioned, these for-profit universities. In some research, it's called the high cost of being poor. When you have to turn to predatory folks to get the capital you need to live your life, to pay your rent, to keep your lights on, because nobody around you has any money, then you are subject to the enormous interest rates that they charge, and you have no choice because you have nowhere else to turn. And so an enormous amount of predation, as Dr. Braithwaite mentioned, just by virtue of the fact that people don't have access to capital. And in America, the coin of the realm is coin. And coin gets you shelter, to Dr. Pethia. Coin gets you mental health counseling if you can't afford it, to Madison's point. I mean, coin is what unlocks opportunity. For me, just as another example, because I have coin, when my son needed to get home from school, I could pay for an Uber to get him home from school. I didn't have to leave my job to go pick him up from school, because I had the wherewithal to pay somebody else to do it. If you're a wage worker and your kid has to, and you get that horrible call from school, your kid is throwing up at the bathroom, not only are you worried about your kid, but you're like, I got to go tell my manager I have to leave my job because I can't pay a Uber to go pick them up. And then that's a black mark on your record. And then the employer says, I knew it. I knew as soon as I hired that single mom that they were going to be taken off work all the time, and I don't have patience for that, because their kid threw up at school and they couldn't afford to have somebody else go get them and take the child home. That's the reality. So we've got to figure out, how do we get more money into the pockets of poor people? And I think and just again, I'm sorry for filibustering. I did work for 8 years in the Senate, and it comes naturally, so I apologize. But to Dr. Pethia's point, we do benefit by looking at both sides of that equation. The reason that people have to earn $45,000 a year in Albemarle County is because the cost of housing is so high. If we could lower expenses, we could lower the amount of the amount of money that people need to earn, and lower the amount of time it takes them to get skilled up to earn that amount of money. So we definitely need to be working on both sides of the ledger. If we can get, pre-K education for kids that are 3 and avoid that $13,000 expense for that single mom when her kid turns 3 and doesn't have to wait till they're 5 and go to kindergarten, we've just boosted her income by $13,000. If we can provide her an affordable place to live, we've just boosted her income. So definitely working on both sides of the ledger, whether it's cash benefits on the income side or more wages on the income side, or figure out ways to provide them services for less money on the expense side. They're both ways that we can together in the poverty crisis that we have in America.
Thank you. Let me just remind our attendees, if you have any questions that you would like or any comments you would like to ask our panelists, feel free to enter them into the chat box and I will read them, or Evan will read them. One of us will read them and address them to our panelists. Dr. Braithwaite, I just wanted to ask you a quick question. You had said that you didn't see, you saw parallels between the United States and the developing countries that you've worked with. And that actually surprised me, to be honest. Can you talk about some of those parallels, or why you elaborate a little bit more on what you meant by that?
So the things that concern me in the United States are the loss of the social compact, of the loss of the willing to help each other out, that is a part of the American story, and I think a wonderful part of American society. And I've seen that erode over time. My feeling is that when you have a very high inequality situation, and we are a very high inequality country, that causes lots of problems. It causes lack of social cohesion. It has some of the political paralysis that we've had in this country. And now we have a situation where people can't walk across the aisle and come to an agreement about what we should do about policy. I personally think that we need to tax the uber wealthy and the rich much more. And that, to me, shouldn't be such a divisive political issue, and yet it is in this country. So those are the kinds of things that I'm saying. I also think that there's a tendency of Americans to think that we are the best and the brightest, and that we've done the greatest thing in the world, and we can't learn from other people. And I remember probably 10 years ago, 15 years ago, I went to Botswana. And in Botswana, there's universal health care. This was before the Affordable Care Act. So they had universal health care, health insurance, health care, and education, including through the tertiary level, is free at Botswana. Now, Botswana has two advantages. And the biggest advantage is it's an exceptionally well-governed country. And then the second thing is that when they found their diamond wealth, they put it in a national trust, and they spent out of that national trust for health and education needs of their population. It's a small country, it's relatively homogenous, and it has had a succession of democratically elected leaders. It's never had a coup, for example, since joining independence. And, I used to, when I was working there with people, kind of as an icebreaker, I would say, we don't have universal health insurance in the United States. And they were shocked. How could this be possible that the world's richest country, all right, the greatest superpower, blah, 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 didn't have basic health care, basic health insurance for people. And, and so I think that we need to learn from other people. I think we need to look to the example of countries that have done better than we have in solving some of these persistent problems. At the same time, Ms. Lindberg, I gotta say that this attitude of stigmatizing the poor is not unique to the United States. It's every country that I've ever talked to a government to try and say, you really need to give a cash transfer to poor people. And we really want to make sure that we target it to mothers because they will use it for their children's need. You get this kind of pushback kind of thing that we've all dealt with in dealing with poverty here. So in that sense, human nature is, fairly constant the world over. And this attitude of grouping us into a privileged group, grouping people into a privileged group, and the out group, it happens, viciously in places. In developing countries, leads to a lot of civil war, leads to a lot of death. So I'm not saying that we're falling apart like some of the countries that I've worked on, including most recently. But I am saying that we need to watch it with the inequality, because that can be really a problem for social stability and for social consensus in grappling with difficult issues. And we have lots of difficult issues. Poverty is the nearest and dearest to mine, but we've got the climate change issue that is, even more of a challenge in some ways, I think. Mainly because we haven't been dealing with it that's well. We're still coping with the global pandemic. We've got to do something about getting vaccines out to the rest of the world so that this pandemic can be stopped. So there are lots of challenges. But my concern is that high degrees of inequality and stigmatizing low income and poor people is not the way to go about it, solving it.
Thank you. Thank you. We do have a question here in the question and answer part, and I guess I will just put it out there, and whoever wants to address it. The question is, are microloans an effective way to help people go over temporary hurdles? And are there such initiatives in Charlottesville and Albemarle County?
So they can be, as long as people can earn enough, have enough extra discretionary spending to pay the microloan back. But the people who we work with at Network to Work, who are kind of in that dicey spot, can and do take advantage of microloans. And I'm happy that a number of institutions, of banking institutions actually in our community, are really stepping up to try to figure out, how do we give reasonably priced loans to people to get them over a hurdle. And we are currently working with the UVA Community Credit Union on such a product for job seekers. Bank of America is rolling out a commercial product that does the same thing, which is, you can borrow $750 or up to $2,000 at a reasonable rate, like 6%, not 237%. Quick anecdote, I mentioned about the title loan. Payday lenders, I actually helped one of our job seekers pay off a payday loan. And I literally stood in line up at Pantops to pay off that loan. And I looked over at the federally required board that showed the interest rate for the loan that I was paying off. The annual percentage rate for the loan I was paying off was 611%. So microloans, much better option than a 611% payday lender. So that is an answer for folks who have a little bit extra that they can pay off that loan. So that is an excellent option for some, and it definitely is becoming more widely available as people recognize that fixing that car is really essential to keeping people working, and they're just one thrown rod away from needing a major car repair. And I think one of the things these banks, and I've talked to a lot of these bankers, and they're very community minded. What they see and what we know is, in a consumer-based economy, which America is, the more money that consumers have, the better off the economy is. So there is a community interest in people making more money, because if they make more money, they buy more cars, they buy more phones, they buy more stuff, they can do more. So not only does it free up their bandwidth as human beings if they're not worried about money all the time, so there's just the moral imperative to try to get people out from the crush of the low-wage economy, but it actually ends up benefiting all of us if people have more money and spend more money and consume more, and we then produce more, and more workers then have to be hired to meet the production needs. Let that aside the supply chain problems we're having right now, but it is a virtuous cycle if we just could bring ourselves to say, well, maybe we should help out that poor neighbor, because maybe if they earn more money, it not only would help them be a better human being because they're freed up from the stress and live longer, but it would also help our economy because they can go out and, visit our restaurants and buy our goods.
Mhm.
Enlightened self-interest.
Right. Right. I can tell you are a history major.
And that's another thing, that actually we are learning from other countries because, Mohammed Yunus won the Nobel Prize a long time ago for microlending in Bangladesh. So these are things that have been tried and been successful in even very low income environments. And there's something that we absolutely need to think about doing.
And there's actually through, I think, the Allstate Foundation and possibly Verizon, there's a microlending program to help specifically survivors of domestic violence to improve their credit score. So I think it's just like $100 loan or something like that they can pay off over time. So that definitely can help with, like I said, the even if I have plenty of clients that have a job that pays them enough that they could afford an apartment, but no one will accept their application because of their credit score or the history of evictions or because of past circumstances. So yeah, they definitely can be helpful.
Now, Ms. Ferguson, you're absolutely right. And you mentioned eviction. So let me make a plug for a really fantastic book called Evicted, which is about the high cost of housing and how people are preyed upon by the system and by landlords to jack up the rents so high. And this whole process of what getting an eviction does on your record. It's poison for renting a house in the future. And as Ms. Ferguson knows, it's particularly acute if you're a victim of domestic violence and you can't get a place to live away from your abuser.
Well, you also have to not just the evicted side of it, but there are often issues with domestic violence in rental apartments where if the police are called too many times, you will become you get evicted then. So so even if a woman is, or a man, whoever the victim is able to move out of that abusive situation and find their own place, there's no guarantee that the abuser is not going to come visit them on a regular basis. So then the police will be called, the tenant will be evicted. And so now that individual is right where they started, pretty much. And so I know people that have gone back to their abusers simply because they've lost their home because they just kept showing up. So
yeah, so definitely another policy we need to advocate for, because it varies. Some states have protections for housing protections for victims of domestic violence. Virginia is not one of them. So things to think about for sure.
And just on the credit score, I mean, I do like those programs that allow you to build your credit by giving you small loans that you can afford to pay back. And there's also been a very slow move toward looking at regular payments beyond paying off a credit card, like if you make regular utility payments, if you've regularly paid the rent, shouldn't that count toward your reliability as a tenant? Because those things that you can control, you are controlling. And so, we need to keep, I mean, as I said at the beginning, the people are not unreliable. It's that they don't have any money. And people say, why don't they manage their money better? Well, they don't have any. They don't have any money to manage. And so building a credit score is very difficult to do. So those loans that let you do that are great. You may be surprised to learn, maybe not, that there are some employers that look at your credit score in order to determine whether or not to give you a job. And I thought, let's turn that on its head. Let's say you deserve the job if you've got a low credit score because you clearly need the money. So if we're allowed to use credit scores as a guide in hiring, why don't we use people with low credit scores? Why don't we use the low credit score as a guide to hiring rather than the high credit score? I say that slightly tongue in cheek, but people need that quality job.
I just want to correct myself really quick. So sorry. Virginia does have protections for housing protections for victims of domestic violence. That was my fault. It does vary state to state, but landlords cannot evict you for neighbor complaints or calls to 911. And housing providers cannot refuse to rent to you because you are leaving a domestic violence situation. But then you get to the part of, okay, if someone does that to you, then what? You got to find a lawyer.
Right.
So whole nother situation, but that's my fault. There is state law that protects victims.
Thank you. I mean, one thing I think, Madison, that both you and Dr. Schuyler have touched upon too, is that there's the bigger issue of poverty in general, and then there's the issue of sort of generational poverty. I think, Dean Schuyler, you were kind of touching on that, and then the issue of education. But then there is the issue of race and gender that it seems to disproportionately affect women and minorities. So
yeah, if you can remember back to the table I had put up, the poverty rate is double for people of color than it is for people non-white Hispanics, and the poverty rate is also higher for women and men. And I think I stepped on you, Ms. Furgurson. My apologies.
That's okay. I was just gonna jump in and say, one thing we haven't talked about was how we fund public education, that it's based on property taxes. And so you are, from the get-go, are at a disadvantage based on the neighborhood you live in. And so there's generational poverty. So just experiencing that your parents don't have resources and so they can't assist you when you need help, but also the generational trauma of experiencing racism and poverty and how that affects the mental health of your parents and how that puts you at greater risk for mental health and domestic violence.
And, just to put a sad exclamation point on that, according to the Health Inequality Project, a poor person in the city of Charlottesville will live a life that is 12 years shorter than a wealthy person in the city of Charlottesville. So being poor costs you 12 years of your life. And so if that isn't reason enough to change the way we do things, I don't know what is. But the racial component is true. I mentioned at the beginning, the racial inequality in the city of Charlottesville, in the city proper. While 13% of white families make less than $35,000 a year, it is 54% of Black families that make less than $35,000 a year. So more than half the Black families in our city make less than $35,000 a year. And that is a difficult, and the Federal Reserve has said that the biggest explanation for the racial wealth divide that exists in our country is unequal labor income. If you don't make much money, you can't save much money, you can't buy a house, you have no money. And so the unequal labor income is the starting point of the yawning wealth divide that we have in this country. And different researchers put it at a different place, but generally speaking, a white family has 13 times the wealth of a Black family in America. So the average white family has $150,000 in assets, where the average Black family has about 11,000. It is just as plain as day that there is something very inequitable in our system that we need to be as intentional in addressing as we were intentional in creating.
Yes, well put. Yeah. Dr. Braithwaite, I liked how you gave a book recommendation. I was wondering if any of you have, this is a library, of course, and I feel like one of the great things about this memoir Maid, as well as the Netflix series, is it is at least allowing people to start to have a conversation about these kinds of issues. And I think as we all kind of discussed, as you all pointed out, these are sort of almost taboo things to talk about. And so I think if we can all start talking about them, that's a good start. So if you have any books or anything you would recommend, feel free to share.
The Color of Law. The Color of Law, which goes to the point of we have been intentional about blocking our Black neighbors from accumulating wealth, and it's as plain as day, and it has nothing to do with how hard people work. It was a policy of the government to block people from home ownership, among other things. So The Color of Law, it's accessible, it's powerful. I definitely recommend it.
Thank you.
I would say, and this is an older book, Nickel and Dime.
I was going to say that. I really like. Yep.
I think Barbara Ehrenreich did a really good job of describing what it is like to work in these low-paying jobs. And she went from, working a diner to working at Walmart, and describing the experiences and how she struggled to get by on the salary that she earned. So that's one of my favorites.
Thank you.
This one doesn't necessarily address poverty, but Whole Again by let's see, Jackson McKenzie. Talks about narcissistic abuse.
Okay.
Which
thank you.
I think is good for anyone that's experienced emotional abuse, because like I said, there's a lot more awareness or empathy for physical abuse. And so there's lots of people that don't realize until they've read a book like this or talked to someone like me or gone to a counselor, they don't even realize that what they went through was abusive. So reading a book like that can help people feel like they're not alone, that what happened to them was not their fault, that it wasn't something that they did or didn't do. So that can be really useful, because you have to have the self-esteem and the mental health to fill out the job application, to go to 3 different apartment complexes to look for an apartment. So like we talked about, coming at this from all sides, in order to put in all this hard work, to find housing, to find a job, to secure benefits, you have to take care of your mental health. And so a big part of that is helping people regain their self-worth and realize that they are worthy of respect and basic rights like shelter and health care, and a job that pays them a living wage.
Thank you. Well, Dr. Braithwaite, did you want to recommend a book? I don't want to. You probably have
I recommended 3, and I put them all, and everybody else is in the chat, so you can see them written down if you're out there in the audience and didn't catch the names of the books. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. And I feel like this discussion is just the very, very tip of the iceberg, but I really, really am grateful to all of you for taking the time tonight to talk about these issues. I don't think they're talked about very often. And so I really appreciate it. And I will make sure to have your resources available in case people reach out to us to learn more about any of you. And is it okay if I share your contact information as well? Okay, excellent. Thank you. Thank you so much. Well, with that, I will say good night. And once again, thank you. And take care, everyone.
Thank you. It was great sharing a stage with you.
Thank you very much. This was great. Thanks for organizing this.
Oh, my pleasure. Take care. Bye-bye.
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 Thank you, everyone.